Hello everyone, Thomas here, and welcome to this special Halloween 2015 edition of SFF180. Are you all seated comfortably? That's good. Now, science fiction and horror. They're like peanut butter and chocolate. They go straight to your hips and significantly boost your chances of contracting type 2 diabetes. Okay, maybe that wasn't the best simile I could have thought up. The point is, they're two great flavors that go great together, so why don't we see more science fiction horror on the racks? Movies and video games are, of course, packed to the rafters with SF horror. But those are media that engage their audiences in a much different and arguably more visceral way than reading, which requires a bit more active intellectual audience participation. After all, it is pretty hard to pull off a jump scare on the printed page. But one reason that literary SF horror is so hard to come by probably has a lot to do with the fact that thematically, those two genres are very much at odds with each other. Horror is rooted in the Gothic tradition, which paints a picture of the world as a sinister and frightening place in which we're all more or less at the mercy of capricious fate, and forces beyond our control are lying in wait behind every blackened, twisted tree trunk and deep within every gabled mansion. Science fiction, on the other hand, like science, assures us that while we will encounter many baffling and terrifying phenomena as we explore the universe, it is all ultimately knowable and rational. So here you've got two worldviews that butt heads pretty bluntly. And it may be why that when you really look at, for example, cinematic SF horror, all you're really seeing is traditional Gothic horror that just happens to have a futuristic setting, right? Alien is a classic monster on the loose story, except in space. Event Horizon, it's a haunted house movie. In space. Now, you may hear some people argue that zombie fiction is science fiction because it usually involves a post-apocalyptic scenario, there's been some kind of devastating plague, of course, or some incredibly unethical government lab somewhere has been experimenting with a virus and, oh, now great, look, we're all shambling undead. But I'm not so convinced of that. I mean, I personally don't consider stories that are blatantly anti-science to be science fiction, thank you very much. Also, there's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is considered the first proper science fiction novel ever published, and which, of course, went on to inspire one of the most iconic horror movie monsters ever. And yet, the novel itself, I would say, is a whole lot more of a Gothic tragedy based on Promethean myth. It's not really meant to be horror. You're meant to feel a sense of pathos, not fear towards the creature. Still, spend a little time digging, and yes, you can find either stories that are either full-on science fiction horror, or, at the very least, are science fiction that employs the tropes of horror in order to create a sense of fear and tension and unease in you, the hapless, unsuspecting reader. And aren't you lucky, because on this Hallows Eve, I have come up with no fewer than 7 recommendations for stories that you can read in your cold sleep capsule by flashlight. They cover the entire spectrum of writing, from complete series, all the way to standalone novels, to short fiction. One of the very best examples isn't even in book form, traditionally, at all. So, lock your door, be sure to check the basement for random giant alien egg sacs, and then pull the bedclothes all the way up to your neck, because we are getting ready to warp into the dark between the stars. Check the dictionary under nihilism and you are likely to find the full text of this bleak little nightmare that many people will tell you is extreme even for Harlan Ellison. In this story's black-as-pitch future, humanity's predilection for perpetual war has caused us to build an artificial intelligence called AM to wage our wars for us. But AM becomes self-aware, and in its bottomless loathing for the creatures that created it, has wiped out the entire human race save for 4 men and 1 woman, who now live deep within AM's globe-spanning substructure. AM has dedicated all of its nearly godlike powers to the perpetual degradation and torture of its 5 victims, all of whom it has altered in various horrific ways and made nearly immortal, so that their torture never stops. It is literally hell. If you thought Jigsaw from the Saw movies was the ultimate sociopath, AM makes him look like Grover from Sesame Street. This story is not for everyone, to put it mildly, and it's likely to leave even readers who like this sort of thing feeling pretty queasy. And it certainly won't change the minds of those readers who are already predisposed to think of Harlan Ellison as a nasty piece of work generally. But there's no denying this Hugo-winning story's brutal, unforgiving power, which, by my estimation, requires an average of 3 solid hours of kitten hugging to fully pull yourself out of. Now, Richard Paul Russo hasn't written a book in 10 years. We kind of need to get on him about that. But this particular space opera into terror is the sort of novel that a lot of writers would be perfectly proud to retire on. One of the most riveting and intense space operas I have certainly ever read. It's the story of the Argonos, a massive generation ship that has been in space for so long, like actual centuries, that no one on board remembers its original mission, or when, or where, or why, or how it was even launched. Our protagonist is Bartolomeo, the confidant of the ship's ineffectual and borderline alcoholic captain Nikos, who is himself embroiled in a power struggle with the ship's bishop, Saldano. Now, the bishop, of course, believes that it should be the ship's mission to travel the galaxy finding any human colonies that are around and spreading the gospel to them. And it is on one such landing on a remote world that the bishop calls Antioch that Bartolomeo and the crew find evidence of an unimaginable tragedy. This eventually leads to the discovery in deep space of an even more vast and inexplicable alien presence. From there, things get bad. And then they get really bad. The book is a slow burner that I think wisely refrains from answering all of the questions that it raises, which heightens the mystery and dramatic tension that Russo, slowly, but with devastating effect, parcels out. Many of the characters, some of whom possess extremely deep religious convictions, are confronted with the challenge of having to reconcile the presence of very real evil in a universe that they believe to be divinely ordered. Ship of Fools is a story that will burrow deep under your skin and not crawl out for a long time. Peter Watts writes uncompromising hard science fiction that is often quite freaky by default, as in his Deep Sea Rifters series, which, if like me you are terrified of the deep ocean, will give you nightmares. Or his Hugo-nominated short story, The Things, which retells the story of John Carpenter's film, The Thing, from the point of view of The Thing. But Blind Sight is in a class by itself, a novel which explores the question of intelligence and consciousness in a post-human future. Several years after tens of thousands of alien probes appear all at once in Earth's orbit, effectively surveying the entire planet all in one shot, an Earth spacecraft, the Theseus, attempts to track a signal into deep space to its likely point of origin. But the crew awakens from cold sleep 5 years late, finding themselves deep within the Kuiper Belt and confronting a massive alien structure 10 times the size of Jupiter, which they call Rorschach. Now it communicates with them, and despite being warned not to, they set down. Things get bad. Now, like Ship of Fools, Blind Sight is, in its own way, a very slow burn, as the central themes here have to do with how technology in a speculative post-human future will alter our minds, our perceptions, our very humanity. Watts was inspired by the Chinese room argument, which is a kind of debate going on in AI circles over whether or not any AI, no matter how sapient, could or could not develop true consciousness in the same way that a human being can. Our viewpoint character is Siri Keaton, who as a child had one entire hemisphere of his brain removed and replaced with technology in an effort to cure his epilepsy. Now this robbed him of normal human empathy, but he adapts by the mimicry of observed behaviors. But it's the aliens on Rorschach that are Watts' masterstroke, beings unlike any you have ever seen in science fiction. And in the book's second half, Watts ratchets the story's tension up to nearly unbearable levels. It's like a book for people who read Rendezvous with Rama and thought, yeah, this is cool and everything, but what if you made it really frickin' scary? Long before a Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin was killing characters, and he was using some terrifyingly intelligent bugs to do it. Now, in the 1970s, George was respected as a sharp but still emerging talent when he sprung this nasty little surprise on everyone during that legendary first year of Omni magazine. Now, his protagonist here is an epic asshole named Simon Kress, who collects exotic pets, and who is immediately captivated by the crawly creatures of the title, who have a habit of building hives like little castles, and actually sculpting the faces of their human owners onto them. Now, being a god to a whole race is naturally very appealing to the sociopathic nature of somebody like Kress, but when the consequences of that nature catch up to him, well, then he learns the hard way what it's like for a god when his followers turn on him. Now, I remember when this story was new. I was pretty young, but I was just old enough to be starting out in fandom, and it is no exaggeration to say that this freaked everyone's shit, and it put Martin squarely on the map. It is full of memorable scenes, in the same way that finding a massive spider under your bed sheets is memorable, and the ending is, well, appropriately sick, but kinda schadenfreudy at the same time. If you've got the stomach for it, you can read Sand Kings as part of George's currently in-print short story collections, Dream Songs. The Burning Dark. Now, this is one that I've already reviewed in full here on the channel about a year and a half ago when it came out, so I'll go ahead and link that. But even though it's an imperfect novel that kinda bungles its climax, for readers who get off to that deep-in-your-bones chill you feel with scenes of wandering dark and deserted space station corridors, where frightening apparitions lurk in the shadows, it's hard to beat a lot of what Adam Christopher has done here. It's the far future once again, and a military commander whose reputation is under a bit of a cloud is assigned to a distant space station orbiting an anomalous star. Now there, he manages to pick up a mysterious signal, again with the mystery signals, on an illegal deep subspace frequency that may have originated over 1,000 years ago. Immediately everything ratchets up to creep factor 9 as crew begin randomly disappearing without explanation, and ghostly figures appear to wander the station. Now, Christopher took quite a lot of inspiration from the urban legend. I guess it's an urban legend if it takes place in space. Anyway, the legend of the lost cosmonauts, which you can Google for yourself, and fashioned, at least for as long as it works, a memorably shuddery deep space creepypasta. This trilogy of novels, consisting of the Nebula Award-winning Annihilation and its sequels Authority and Acceptance, takes the premise of science confronting the unknown to its absolute apex. Now, it is a trilogy that many readers find more alienating than accessible, mainly because it offers no easy answers to its questions and seems to relish its own status as a big fat mystery box, without seeming to have much of an urgency towards steering you to understanding. But stick with it, because Jeff Vandermeer's story is legitimately unique in science fiction. And when it's unsettling, which is often, it's unsettling in a manner that makes you think of The X-Files as written by Cormac McCarthy. The premise involves an anomaly known as Area X, located along an unspecified region of the West Coast, and the scientific facility, the Southern Reach, set up to study it. Within Area X, nature has been strangely and subtly altered. A dozen expeditions have ended mostly in bizarre tragedy, with explorers either murder-suiciding each other or finding their way back to civilization by unknown means and re-emerging in a deeply altered state themselves. Some are just plain lost or absorbed into Area X's alien ecosystem. Book 1, Annihilation, recounts the 12th expedition into Area X, while Book 2, Authority, is set entirely within the Southern Reach, and reveals hidden secrets and agendas within the Southern Reach's leadership and the powers that they answer to. Acceptance rounds out the story over 3 narrative threads, covering periods of time before and after Books 1 and 2. For some characters, the journey outward represents a journey inward, while for others, having to confront the fact that the world they once thought was reasonably ordered and sensible is anything but, leaves them profoundly impacted. If you're ready to meet Jeff Vandermeer on his own terms here, you're going to find a story that you will not soon forget. It's an experience unlike any you have had in the genre, And you'll feel lucky that you managed to escape Area X relatively unscathed. Finally, not a book at all, the SCP Wiki is one of the internet's most popular online horror writing communities. For those of you still uninitiated, the premise involves a shadowy enterprise known as the SCP Foundation, who tirelessly work behind the curtain of our everyday lives, tracking down and protecting us all from frightening, inexplicable, sometimes paranormal, but always deeply weird and unnatural phenomena. The writers in the community compose accounts of each anomaly in the form of a numbered wiki entry detailing the phenomenon itself, how it was discovered, and the means by which the SCP Foundation is containing and studying it. Now, it's this conceit that makes the SCP Wiki an example of science fiction horror, as the whole purpose of the Foundation is to secure, contain, and protect, but not destroy, even in instances where the subject under study is potentially dangerous to all human life. But far from being unsung heroes, the Foundation has its sinister side. Human test subjects, called D-Class personnel, are often involved in the investigation of each phenomena without any regard at all for their safety or even survival. But we're asked to accept that there is a greater good at work here, which presents something of a moral dilemma, to say the least. The SCP community is highly engaged, and each new entry is vetted and critiqued, with the writers making frequent edits to their entries. With sharp-eyed readers keeping an eye out for hackneyed ideas, writers are encouraged to flex their imaginations to the fullest to keep everything fresh and original. With the result that even though these people, most of them, are total amateurs writing under the relative anonymity of a username, the best of them are doing work that is the equivalent, and in many cases much better than, the work of seasoned, published professionals. The very best SCP entries, and I'm not gonna lie, are full-on "you are not sleeping this week" terrifying. Just look under the list of highest rated entries and see for yourself. Others can be funny or thought-provoking or sentimental or touching or sometimes simply surreal. Quite often, an inexplicable mixture of all those things. It's the kind of site that you can spend hours getting lost in, which you will then punish yourself for much later when it's 4 a.m. and you're sitting up wide awake with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat, and singing My Little Pony songs. But once you're hooked, you're hooked. And once you've peeked behind that curtain, well, it's impossible to unsee what you saw lurking there. So thank you all for joining me, and I hope you found something to thrill you and chill you. Remember to like, share, and sub, and until I see all of you guys next time, spooky reading.